Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
On this episode of the Sumud podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify award-winning Palestinian author, social activist, policy analyst, and journalist, Laila El-Haddad. Laila is well known for speaking about Gaza, the intersection of food and politics, her journey as a Palestinian mother and journalist, and contemporary Islam. In 2014, she appeared on CNN's Parts Unknown with Anthony Bourdain, guiding him through the Gaza Strip in the episode Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, showcasing Gaza in a rare and humanizing light.
And we are your hosts, Hasan and Zaina Ashrawi. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you watch or listen, and follow us on social media either at Sumud Pod or at Sumud Podcast. Welcome, Laila. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I feel like I'm sitting in your living room and we're about to drink some mahwa.
Absolutely. It's inshallah one day we'll actually do it in person and we actually will drink together. But before we start, I really want to send and extend our deepest condolences for the loss of your family members in Gaza and to you and to your family members as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You know, I keep saying the reason we keep speaking out and writing and protesting and organizing is for them. I mean, they continue to guide me. That's their mandate of us. And that's, I think, how we honor the memory of those who have been killed as well. I feel like it's the least we can do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and speaking of that, living in the diaspora and kind of watching this happen with your family makes me wonder about your early life, because I know you were born, I believe, in Kuwait and grew up in Saudi. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I was born in Kuwait. I don't remember it because I was very young. Maybe I'll back up before that and say that my parents were both born in Gaza, my mother in Khan Yunis. Like many Palestinians in the 1960s, they studied in Abdel Nasser's Egypt at the time, medical school in different cities. They then in 1967 were rushed back because there was a need for physicians with the Red Cross. And I think they were very separately, they hadn't met yet. And they were very lucky in that sense because, of course, as we all know, any Palestinian who happened not to be in Palestine at that time was then not given a hawiyya, an identity card, right? The system that the Israelis used to divide and conquer and control the movement of Palestinians, also enabling them to return. I always feel odd when I say it out loud, like to their own home, right? Suddenly overnight, they lost that right. And so they were lucky in that sense. They were able to get back to Gaza, where they served in the aftermath, and then met in Gaza in the early 70s and were married there. And at some point, my father went to finish his training in England for a year, back to Gaza, and then had received an opportunity to go and work in the Gulf. Like many, as we know, tens of thousands of Palestinians, the Gulf was hiring. Most of the professionals at that time, many happened to be Palestinians. Almost now universal rates of literacy, some of the highest rates of literacy at the time in the region, I think. And so they took that leap. Things were becoming very difficult for my father because the Israelis were harassing him in the hospital. And so he decided that he wanted to be able to pursue that option. Now, we were able to retain our hawiyya, and in order to do so, of course, we had to continuously go back and forth between, at that time, Saudi Arabia, where we were living in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia and Dhahran, to Gaza. And we were, I would say, one of a minority of Palestinians of our small, tight-knit Palestinian community who was specifically from Gaza and specifically had a hawiyya and specifically would go back on an almost yearly basis to renew it. And I remember that journey well because it was like this sort of clandestine group of 2 or 3 families, and we would kind of exchange notes about, you know, the latest on the border crossings. For a long time, it was the Jisr through Jordan. And then at some point, that was no longer accessible to Palestinians from Gaza. And so then we had to go through Egypt. And there was various times, depending on the political situation in the region, where then Egypt wouldn't let us in. I think it was after the Gulf War. So we were always exchanging notes about the best mode of travel. It was always by land, of course, but what were the latest updates? And if there was, you know, a special ingredient that we wanted to get from Gaza, we would then put in that request with those 2 or 3 families. But that journey back and forth, I think it's ingrained in the mind of any Palestinian who has made the journey not just to Gaza, during, specifically, this was the 80s and the 90s, but I would say, more broadly, to Palestine, whether it's through the Jisr, through, I'm sure Zaina can attest to this. But yeah, but you never forget. I think, I've frequently said that it's informed a lot of what I talk about. Those journeys have informed my take on the Palestinian experience. I think it's what Laila El-Haddad calls the quintessential Palestinian experience on borders. And, it wasn't easy. I mean, a lot of those years were during the First Intifada. And now at that time, we were still allowed to go through the Jisr. So it involved, of course, endless hours and humiliation and strip searches. And, all I remember is being like coming of age, being the scrawny, like whatever, 11-year-old, and being told to just strip down. And then all of your clothes and socks are kind of thrown in this big pile. And when they're done with you, they, and I don't know if Zaina, you have similar experiences or not, you were just told to go like a bunch of animals, rush towards this pile of clothes and retrieve your clothes and socks, just kind of sift through that mess. And I remember at one point they told my mother to take off her underwear, and she refused because she had her, her menstrual cycle. And I just remember being horrified, like, why is this happening? Why? I didn't even know what that was at that point, but I understood there was something deeply violating about this experience but very invasive. And anyway, and then after that, of course, it was the Rafah crossing. But maybe just a word on like being a Palestinian in the Gulf. We always understood, my mom comes from a long line of very active, politically active, not in the sense of like she herself wasn't politically active, but I would say politically aware, let's put it that way, Palestinians. So whether it was her uncle, Allah yarhamu, Dr. Muhammad al-Farra, who himself has had an incredible story, left Khan Yunis in 1947 to the U.S., sort of built himself up, worked for the Syrian delegation in the UN before becoming the Jordanian ambassador to the UN, before there was a Palestinian representation, and has this phenomenal, very short book, memoir called Years of No Decision. I encourage everyone to read it if they haven't already. So he would frequently visit us when we were there, and through him we gleaned a lot of, we gleaned these nuggets that we wouldn't have otherwise, because where were you supposed to gain your information and your knowledge from? And I say this as a preface to then what I felt was important to work on in later years. We would see the news, the nightly news, and it was a constant stream, of course, of the latest fatalities and casualties in the First Intifada. But I attended international schools, and even if I wasn't, the public schools weren't open to Palestinians in Saudi Arabia. This was the reason that we had to attend these private schools. But you weren't being taught that your history, right? We had one Arabic class, and we were lucky in the sense that for many years the Palestinians pushed to have a Jordanian curriculum, so at least we were getting a little bit of the history. But it was largely through my mother's, oral history, I would say, what she had learned from her uncle and parents that was conveying to us. But our textbooks, or atlases, or dictionaries, again, this is probably not news to any Palestinian, maybe of our generation. We're all Israel, 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 right? Palestine was just erased completely. And and if it wasn't for my mother reinforcing the importance of that history, a lot of it didn't make sense, but we felt this urgency about, well, my God, we have to remember these dates. Like if we don't remember these dates, we'll be completely gone, right? It's sort of the utmost importance. It's this existential crisis that every Palestinian has. Like we have to remember 1948, 1967, but then there's Land Day, and then there's this, and then there's that. And so that's what I remember my childhood being like. It's just this almost like a survival, importance of your survival instincts kicking in. And I think a lot of Palestinians they got a little comfortable. I know I had an uncle in Kuwait that my father's eldest brother was very close to. We were in Saudi Arabia. We were lucky in the sense, again, that my mother understood the critical importance of maintaining our ties to the Blad, to Palestine, to Gaza, and made sure we renewed our ID. So we always had a chance to go back. And she kept saying, you never know what's going to happen. Like you have to. I had an aunt in Jeddah that didn't do that. I had an uncle that it wasn't his fault. He wasn't there in 1967. And some Palestinians got a little comfortable. And in 1991, the first Gulf War happened. Of course, tens of thousands of Palestinians were evicted from Kuwait mainly. But, we were a handful of people that were able to stay in our small compound. Everybody else was evacuated, whether it was Americans, Europeans. And the other Palestinians in Kuwait were evicted. And so that was the first time I would say that I understood political vulnerability for the first time, because we didn't have any foreign citizenship like a lot of other people. We didn't even have a Jordanian passport. We had a temporary, what was called a 2-year temporary Jordanian document for Palestinians from Gaza that we then lost a few years after that. And we ended up having a Palestinian for just until very recently. And so that was the first time I would say I understood what it meant to be vulnerable, that we didn't belong anywhere. We didn't have the place. There was no permanence to any of this, that in a moment's notice, we could too, be kicked out or something happen, or, we'll always bear the brunt for any kind of anything that's happening, right? Any political developments in the region. Sorry, I could keep going, but I'm going to stop because I feel like
Yeah, I'm actually just going to comment, and then we'll
Yeah.
go on with the questions. But I think it's so important to highlight the fact, the importance of the documentation that you spoke about, because you're talking about your Jordanian passport. You lived in Saudi Arabia, and you're talking about your Jordanian passport, 2 years valid. I was born in Jerusalem, and we had the same exact thing. We had an ID, but we also had a Jerusalem passport that was stamped Palestinian, and we don't have rights either place. So I think the fragmentation and displacement of Palestinians with these sort of exceptional documents that they create for us somehow. My children, I made sure, have Daffa IDs. I don't have an ID, but my husband does. So I think it's a really important point to mention. It keeps us, attached to the politics of the ground to have these, but it's also a way to control us. And it's just mind-blowing to me that we all have to go through that.
It's like a double-edged sword, because I remember growing up with all of these different conversations with cousins and with others, and some saying yes, but then if you do have this ID, you can't go to other places like the Daffa and the rest of Palestine.
Exactly.
Of course, we didn't have the luxury to do that in either case because we had no foreign citizenship. But these are the kinds of conversations that are happening, and you're literally making all of these decisions and calculations about your offspring, your ability to live or reside or visit your own homeland based on these very tenuous documents that, again, I think at some point I said they're supposed to offer passage, but offer passage to nowhere, right? But my uncle, who was in Kuwait, ended up, Allah yarhamu, no country would he tried for months and months. He didn't know where to go. Nobody would take him. He didn't have a hawiyya. He didn't have any, I think his another casualty of a small footnote in the history, right? His one son ended up in Iraq, the other in Germany, one in Saudi, and then he ultimately ended up in Bulgaria, I think, and that's where he died. He was never able to go back to Gaza.
You mentioned living in Kuwait and during the first Gulf War. Were you, and you didn't have to leave, right? You mentioned.
So I actually lived in Saudi Arabia. I left
You're in there.
Kuwait. I was just about a year old, but my uncle was in Kuwait.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't actually experience any of the hate.
No, my uncle very much did. Now, I was in Dhahran, where at that time was housing an American airbase. And so it was a very interesting experience because, again, for viewers who don't remember, that was a time when Palestinians were bearing the political brunt and the fallout of everything that was happening because of Yasser Arafat's decision, of course, to ally himself at the time with Saddam. But no, for sure, we kept a low profile. I mean, it was well known we were Palestinians, but, we were teased a lot by the Americans that were with us in the school. My father was kind of like, keep a low profile. I mean, remember, we had no rights or status, so we couldn't really risk whatever. What were you going to do? Well, I was in 7th grade at the time, but there wasn't much you could do. I had a diary, and I think I was writing down my feelings in there. And at some point, someone took it and read it and was like, oh my God, she's Palestinian or whatever. So, but it was really a handful of us that were left there. I think it was 27 of us at the time for the months that the war was playing out. Because I remember telling my father, but what happened? And the Scuds were, by the way, falling in the vicinity of around our house. That I remember very clearly, the Scud missiles. But he was like, nah, what are we going to do? The Intifada's raging in Gaza. Like, he was like, let's just stay here and see what happens, play it out. And we did. He was always, that's just the way that it rolled. And I do remember, this is something I frequently tell my children. This is another one of those moments that you're like, this is what it means to be Palestinian. The government was handing out gas masks to people because, there was this fear of a chemical weapons attack. And they were calling employees of the company by their numbers and by their nationality. And so who was first getting the gas masks? The Americans. And then the Europeans and the Australians and the Brits. And this moment of panic set in. And I was like, wait, what about us? Students were showing off their gas masks. Every day somebody would have a new type. There was different models. And literally like 2 or 3 weeks later, my dad was like, well, they said if there's any left over, they'll give them to the Palestinians. I remember. And we did ultimately receive the scraps, but I just remember that really clearly, that we're kind of an afterthought in everything, essentially, when it comes to the Arab world, I would say.
And speaking about your dad a little bit, I think I read somewhere where an Israeli official had to come and sort of evaluate a hospital. And he said the hospital has everything it needs. And your dad was like, not so much. This is not right. And kind of stood his ground.
Yeah, this was in the early 1970s when the Israelis were also in control of Gaza's civil administration in addition to occupying it. And so they were involved in these day-to-day decisions, including in the hospitals and so on. And so, yes, that was what I had referenced earlier when that was one of the decisions that he was just sort of sick of continuously being interrogated or questioned. And he just wanted to practice medicine, independent of all that scrutiny. And, it wasn't an easy decision because my mother didn't agree with it. And for years and years and years, till today, she says, I wish he had never, left Gaza. I mean, alhamdulillah, we were returning on a yearly basis and we spent a significant amount of time. That wasn't like we just left and that was it. But she always was of the opinion that no, she wanted to stay. Her side of the family, I would say, is much more like, as I said, politically active. My grandfather was in the Khan Yunis municipality. There's some great pictures that my uncle sent me recently of him in the 1956 standing next to Che Guevara. And, all of these different political personalities and rebels that I think all understood at some point that Gaza is critical to understanding the Palestinian struggle, to understanding anti-colonial struggle, global anti-colonial struggles. Anyways, they visited Gaza, and including Malcolm X and Che Guevara. So he was very active politically. My aunt was very active on an educational level. My aunt, my grandmother, my mother's mother, in terms of standing up as well to the Israelis who were insisting the curriculum be changed, and so on and so forth, my aunts. And yeah, so I think these are the kinds of decisions I would say that all Palestinians grapple with. And they're not easy ones,
It just struck me the fact that his colleagues were basically telling your father to be quiet, don't push, and he stood his ground anyway.
And I think this was very common in the 1970s specifically. This was what was known as the decade of pacification, especially in Gaza. I'm just thinking back in my head, I'm like doing rewind, but that would have been the time of what was known as the pacification of Jabalia, when Ariel Sharon went in and the summary execution, of thousands of young men, Fidaiyin in Jabalia, and they were all shot point blank in the streets and razed down hundreds of homes, not only in Jabalia, but in other refugee camps, tried to create these sort of what he called the equivalent of public housing projects to try to move, because he understood that the camps were sort of what, for lack of a better term, kind of hotbeds of resistance, right? To try to move out Palestinian refugees from there to an area he created called Sheikh Ridwan, which still exists, but it was a huge failure, of course. But yes, that was at the time that I would say before the First Intifada. And I would say from the mid-70s until the First Intifada, there was this sort of, I don't want to say it was like a successful pacification, but like, let's just, look what happened in Jabalia kind of thing. Let's just keep quiet a little bit. There's no need. And I think these are all normal. You have some people who are going to be more outspoken, some who aren't, some who will stand their ground, some who don't think it's worth it. You see this play out, I think, universally, even now, right? Until it doesn't work anymore. And then some major event happens, like the First Intifada. But yeah, I mean, that was definitely a component, I would say, in his thinking, at least.
And as a Palestinian, you have two forms of resistance that sticks out to me the most, right? I think writing is a form of resistance to an extent, and then cooking or food is a form of resistance. For the writing, you mentioned you were keeping diaries early on when you were younger. Did you know that you eventually wanted to, I don't know if we knew what blogging was back then, but whatever you want to call it here. I don't know. I don't want to age ourselves here a little bit, but
Oh, it's all good. No,
yeah.
there was no blogging at that time. Well, it's okay, we can age ourselves. I always tell my kids, at the time I went back and was living in Gaza from like 2003 to 2007, iPhones weren't created. Or maybe at the latter part they were, I guess. But so this was before, not only were iPhones not around, there was no Facebook or X or Twitter or any of this. So, and now we're talking about a period even before that in the early 90s. There wasn't even an internet, right? So no, there was just this plain old, hard bound diary. So I wouldn't say I was always interested in food early on, but I didn't really connect the dots, I think, until later as to why. And, I think that I was a very, very scrawny, very, I didn't really have an appetite for food. It wasn't like I was someone who was naturally, drawn to or had a big appetite or something like that. And this really like bothered my mother, who was a pediatrician. But she always said, if you think that you'll eat it, why don't you try to go to the kitchen and cook something yourself? So I do always give her credit for that. She wasn't like forcing. She was just concerned because I was very malnourished. But like many Palestinian professionals at the time, they were busy. She was a physician. She was working full time, and as I said, there's always these question marks in your head, and things didn't come together. I think that they seem to do now. In a way, I'm kind of jealous of this generation of Palestinians because things are more accessible to them with more resources. It wasn't like that then. You really had to either know someone who could tell you the history, someone learned, or have a grandmother, which wasn't there with us all the time, though she was very learned. She was in Khan Yunis. And that didn't exist. It wasn't like I had someone that I could go and cook with and hear her stories, right? I kind of craved that, but that just, and my grandmother, even when we did visit her, she had zero interest in cooking. She was actually get offended if I asked her to cook something or ask her about, she was like all about women in the workplace kind of thing, was very serious. And she wanted to make sure like we knew history and we were educated. That was what was concerning to. Anyway, but at some point I intuited that food was like an interesting way to learn about our history because I recognized that a lot of the occasional, dishes my mom would make, and she was an okay cook, but she didn't have time or interest. She hated cooking. But she did try to honor whatever, she knew that my father liked by calling his relatives in Gaza because the things she grew up making were very different. Her mother, even though she was born and raised in Palestine, so my maternal grandmother, was actually half Cherkessiya, so Circassian, and half Kurdish Damascene. So my grandmother's mother, who raised her, and she was divorced at a very early age, left her Circassian husband and came to live with her daughter in Khan Yunis, was Kurdish from Damascus. And so that's what influenced my mother's, I would say, that's what she grew up eating, a lot of that kind of food. So she wasn't as well versed in the food of Gaza, even though she was born and raised there. That's another story for another time. But I frequently thought about how these two women, my grandmother and my great-mother, were roaming around the Palestinian, countryside in the 1920s by themselves. But anyway, that's always kind of fascinating me. She took her to Ramallah to learn in a teacher's, I don't know, equivalent of that would be in English, like, what would that be? I'm not sure, like a seminary, an institute, something like that. But she learned, and she was then recruited to go teach in Khan Yunis, where she met my grandfather. But anyways, so she would cook, and I noticed that a lot of these kinds of foods she was making, the sometime dishes like psara, romaniya, things that were kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, weird to other Palestinians, unusual. I was like, well, why are we, what are these? What's the history of these dishes? And why do we make these, but, our neighbors from, whatever, let's don't make them, and I began to ask these questions, and nobody seemed to have the answer to them. And there was no internet. There was no YouTube to search up. Nobody had really documented or written about these. And I just found it very interesting. And I just had always kept it in the back of my mind. Well, this is something I want to explore at a certain point. And whenever I would find someone that knew, I would write down that particular recipe and the history behind it. And then it wasn't until and I do always talk about, for me, food, as I think for a lot of Palestinians in diaspora, was a very tangible way to taste Palestine and to be connected to Palestine, right? Where that has been, deprived of you, even if you have visited, even if you have family there. There's still something very, I don't know what, is ethereal the right word, about food, evocative, and that you didn't get from the textbooks or the history lessons. And
I think you called it somewhere at one point a culinary memory map. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Yes. And it was just many years later, because you hear about the villages, but again, at that point in time where, there's no Wikipedia or Palestine Remembered, you're just relying on whatever. So yeah, you just really don't know. And it wasn't until many years later when I had the chance to finally make this happen, like all the stars were aligned. I always say everything that happens to me is like a crapshoot. I wish I could say I was very methodical and organized, but it just somehow stars align. I'm like, okay, there's a window, jump through it, And that's just how this happened. And I'm like, okay, it's now or never. Everything was aligned in terms of Rafah at that time being open under Mohammed Morsi, in terms of finding a sort of co-collaborator in this crazy project who was very much aligned in her vision about what we wanted to do in terms of just everything, childcare being available. When I was in Gaza, I had 2 young kids. And I think it was during those 3 months, which are absolutely incredible, and I wished I could have spent more time, that I realized, these dishes are a culinary memory map. And it was so important for so many Palestinians, as it continues to be now, with what Gaza is enduring. At that point, it was almost prescient in a way, because they were talking about things in the past that now we're seeing again happen in what was then the future, right? The urgency to, preserve these recipes, not just preserve them, but cook them and talk about them and talk about the history and talk about the villages that have all come into play, post October 7th, that this area that we keep hearing referred to as the Gaza envelope was where their towns and villages were, from after which they name these dishes like salatat beit jirja, kishik beit tima, right? That people might not be familiar with outside of the specific particular neighborhood of a particular group of people in this particular refugee camp from that town or village that lives on through the food. So you could very much map it out and go, this recipe's from here, this dish is from there, even though they continue to make it in modern day in what has become the Gaza Strip. It's incredible, I would say, that the dishes and versions of them have sort of lived on, and that there was this incredible, micro-regionality to the way people were cooking things in Gaza and continue to do so, considering what a small, tiny little space it is. There's these incredibly minute differences that people are very proud of and pass on to their daughters about, no, and this is how we make it in Bet Shirja. We add cucumbers, but we don't do that in the neighboring village or whatever.
Yeah, you do mention how even people that live very close to one another may not know the same dish in Gaza, even though it's a very, very close proximity, but they make completely different meals. They don't even know that it exists. And I thought that was fascinating.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, both in terms of sort of the ingredients, but also the way they were making the food. And I thought that was fascinating because Gaza isn't big. I mean, the whole area is big.
That struck me as, I felt like I was learning so much. And it was a very unusual experience, because here I am, Mahmoud Darwish sums it up best when he says, أنا من هنا أنا من هناك أنا لست هنا أنا لست هناك. I'm from here, I'm from there, I'm not here, and I'm not there. And that's exactly right. Here I was, a Palestinian from Gaza that has known no other, identity or home besides Gaza, who didn't even have other documents besides but feeling like somewhat of a stranger as I was embarking on this, inviting myself to people's homes and cooking with them and learning all these things and I felt like awkward, like almost embarrassed that I didn't know some of this stuff. And I think I grew up feeling that way, like something was deficient in me as a Palestinian. I wasn't Palestinian enough. Perhaps I didn't know how to do dabka. I still don't. My daughter does, so I feel like I success there, But, I didn't know how to, the names of specific dishes. And it never felt right, I wasn't comfortable with that. But anyway, but yes, I was constantly surprised. Every day I was surprised about new things I was learning. That it's not that they're not familiar. They clearly know Somagia is the quintessential Gaza City dish. But it's funny because they would say things like, and this is a family who lived in Deir el-Balah, which is just 15, 20 minutes from Gaza City. And they were from the village of Beit Tima, east of modern day Gaza Strip. And they would say to me like, oh yeah, انتوا الغزازوة بتعملوا السماقية هذه إلكو أكلتكو, the Sumagia is your dish, right? Gaza City. And I was like, what, are you serious? She's like, well, I mean, I don't really know how to make it. But I'm like, what do you mean? You've lived here like your whole life, So I just thought that was really funny. But no, they didn't identify. They would say, okay, we're from, but they didn't identify as being from Gaza, even though they had lived there their entire lives. And tragically, the same family that I'm talking about, it was the grandmother, Allah Yarhamha, who showed me how to make kishik, who I talk about in the book, who was actually killed in an Israeli airstrike. First, she sustained critical injuries, and then she, succumbed to those injuries. And her daughter, Asma, sent me a beautiful picture of her before she died, and then sent me a picture of the remains of their home in Deir el-Balah. And she said, basically this is all that remains. She said the house is gone, and my grandmother is gone, but the memories remain, and they're forever preserved in the book. And the book was like one of the only things that had survived, and she had opened it up to her grandmother's page in the rubble of their home and had taken a picture and sent it to me, which, was so tragic, obviously, and but so moving, and it made me, I feel especially, I part of me is feels fulfilled, but obviously unnerved. It's like all these mixed emotions that I was able to preserve this small sliver of life in Gaza, and obviously before what we know as Gaza before 1948, and in the years following that, in the years before the genocide as well, to give us kind of situate where we are in a way, to be able to say, like, this is what things were like before, this is what it's like now, back when we were writing the book, and what's predicted to happen, and then ultimately what did happen.
I want to make sure I get the names right. Is Hani the one that you're referring to that was hit with the airstrike, or is that?
No, this is another family. This one is, her name was Hajja Ibrahim. Hani's my aunt who was killed in Gaza City, is actually neighborhood of Sheikh Ridwan, last November. Allah yarhamha.
And can you just talk about her influence on you? And the reason I'm asking, it broke my heart a bit when she wanted to show you one last dish, I believe, to make, and you're like, no, we're good, we're done, and then kind of move on. And then I think you realize maybe I should have let her make that dish for me so I could learn.
Yes, so Hani was my aunt on my father's side, and she was one of the only. She was married to my uncle. I think they were also cousins, but she was one of the only ones. My paternal grandmother died pretty young, in her early 50s, and so I never had a chance to meet her. Neither did my mother. But my father, he tears up every time he thinks of her. He was very close to her. He was, and this aunt Hani was the only one who had lived extensively with her, who had memories of her that she could share, and she did share. And I had a privilege of spending a lot of time with her when I was not only living in Gaza for those years that I went back, but also when I was doing the research for the book. And she was always the one of my father's side of the family. We spent much more time with my mother's side in Khan Yunis as kids. And then as I got older, I got more acquainted with my father's side. But she was always the one who would immediately knew we were in town and would come visit us in Gaza City, whether I was there alone, whether it was with my parents, and always come, bearing a bowl of either sumagiya, or if she knew my father really liked maftul, she would make maftul. So that's one thing I remember about her. And the fact that I had done immediately when I heard she was killed, I was like, oh my God, I had like a 2-hour-long interview. She was one of the first people, I interviewed when we were doing the fieldwork for the Gaza Kitchen. I went to the first contacts, and I knew she had an extensive, history of Gaza City, of my family. She knew a lot of dishes. So we spent like 2 hours in her kitchen, and I hadn't listened to that interview in like more than a decade. And so I started to go listen to it all over again, the whole thing. And I didn't realize until the very end, as you said, and it was, just to set the context, it was August of 2010. There was a heat wave in Palestine, in the region, and it was Ramadan. And so I think it was in Fahrenheit, like 105 degrees or something, 110 degrees. And this was at a time when few years after Israel had bombed Gaza's only power plant. It was constant power outages. So at that time, it was 8 or 10 hours of no power, followed by a few hours. So it was no power, no fan, no generator, 110 degrees or whatever. And I was fasting. So I was like a skeleton of myself right now. And I was exhausted. And we had just spent 2 hours right before sunset, like cooking and talking and, So at the very end, I'm reading the interview, remembering all these details. And in the interview, we're saying things like, oh my God, it's so hot. Oh my gosh. And then at the very end, she says, wait, I want to show you how to make sumagiya. That's the most important dish. Because she had spent all this time showing me a bunch of smaller, maybe more trivial, but interesting dishes that my father really liked, that my grandmother used to make, sharing memories of her, showing me pictures from an old album. And then I said, no, Khato, it's almost sunset. My mother's waiting. I'm so hot. I left my kids with her. And she was like, please. And I was like, no, another time. And then I put the interview down, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, why did I say that? You want to go back in time and be like, who cares? I can have dinner with you tonight, leave the kids. Yeah, but I always say another time never came. And, I'm just really lucky, I think, that I had that interview, because my thoughts and prayers really went to her granddaughter, my cousin, Besma, who continues to live in Austria. And she had moved back from Croatia. Her mother is Croatian. Her dad was also killed in this horrific attack, was from Gaza, is my cousin, my direct cousin. They moved back. It took years to get her an ID. And so she spent 10 years away from her father. When she finally got an ID, she moved back to Gaza when she was 10 with her mother. And she spent 10 years with him or so, living with her grandmother and her two aunts and her father, and then went back out to pursue her master's and then hadn't gone back to Gaza. When I had seen her grandmother the last time, she begged me to beg her to come back and visit. And she said, no, my grandmother, she's stuck in her old ways and it's really hard to get to Gaza. No, Besma lost her grandmother, the two aunts who raised her, her mother and her father all at once in this bombing. And so by comparison, my loss was trivial. It's nostalgic, it's heartbreaking, but Besma never recovered from that, and I shared the article with her because I was trying to give words to the grief she was feeling too. And I think every Palestinian's feeling, but she couldn't write or speak. She just couldn't make any sense of what just happened. And she still hasn't been, so I'm sure this is replicated over and over and over again across Gaza. But I always think of Besma because she just lost everyone, the closest people to her in her entire life. And just like that, of course, no accountability, no ability to take anything back. No, the house is gone, the photos are gone, everything is gone, right? Yeah, so I'm just, again, I feel like if you are in a position to be able to, take that grief and I don't know, put it into words, convert it into action, do something with it. I think it's very healing and it's something I think not everyone can do. Besma can do. I do it for her. I do it for my family to be able also to honor our loved ones who have been killed and really nobody gives a bleep about, right? I mean, and so I think we owe it to them, we owe it to ourselves to take on that role if we are able.
I'm really, really sorry for your loss. And there aren't enough words to convey how we feel doing this interview with you, but also, just experiencing this from out here in the US, kind of in the belly of the beast. That has that has to be particularly difficult for you and your family here, kind of be in the space that is perpetuating this violence in a way that is a partner in crime in this genocide.
I mean, I think the way that all Palestinians feel, and I would say not even just Palestinians, others as well, people of conscience, people who still believe in humanity. I mean, it sucks. What can I say? I'm constantly finding myself apologizing and thinking, how can I sort of purify my existence here? And it's through doing whatever small thing. I mean, when people say to me, but what can we do? I'm like, are you serious? Do something, do anything, but don't do nothing. I mean, and that's the message my cousins always give me, and I'm just continuously find myself apologizing just for my mere existence. I keep saying, I apologize for my existence in the country that is responsible for destroying your existence. There's no other way to put it. And it's just, I mean, it's painful to the core. My husband and I keep talking about this. He's not from Gaza. He's from the north. He grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon. But the same applies. And we keep asking ourselves, okay, where can we go? What can we do? And, all I say to people is that just imbues us with a greater responsibility. It obligates us to do more. And, and I spent time I just needed a break. And I went for 2.5 months in the summer to Jordan and to Lebanon. And so I was able to kind of experience it in both places. And I don't know what was worse, because the Palestinians in Jordan were equally, I mean, they were seething, they were simmering. I mean, none of any of the different events, if anybody has been following sort of these isolated incidents that have happened in Jordan, whether it was at the border, whether it was Naqaba and so on and so forth by the Israeli embassy, none of them surprised me after spending those 2 months there. The population is like literally on the brink of explosion. I mean, they're so incredibly, that most are, of course, Palestinian. They're the closest geographically to Palestine and to Gaza and, maybe after Arish, but let's not go there, Egypt. And the way that one taxi driver put it to me was, look, we're physically proximate, but that's where it ends. We couldn't be further away. We're not allowed to do anything. There's these sort of small protests that are suppressed. I went to a few just to see what the vibe was. But they're like, everything is controlled. We can't even send aid unless it's through this one specific charity. We can't even, long story short, I don't know what was worse, that they felt like they were just boiling inside with no outlet and just completely, unable to do anything, powerless, hopeless. And I don't know, or are we deceiving ourselves? I mean, these are the kinds of the conversations that are going through my head all my time. Are we deceiving ourselves with this illusion of freedom here in the United States? But in reality, speaking truth to power really accomplishes nothing, but maybe disruption does. I don't know. I haven't found the correct answer. I feel like it's all a game, and the systems have, but then again, I constantly am saying on the other hand, I don't want to succumb to fatalism and and that in and of itself is sort of a defeat, right? Defeatism and fatalism. So, it's exhausting is the best way to put it. And it's infuriating, exhausting. So many different adjectives come to mind.
Yeah. It's really interesting to me that you say that, because you in particular, you're not just involved in sort of politics in that aspect here in the US. You do the cooking aspect of it and the preserving resistance and preserving the Palestinian culture, but you also were a journalist. And I think that all of that gives an outlet to you, but to others to see what Palestine is, who Palestine is, and Gaza in particular. And just to quickly go back to your roots in Gaza, because I find this really interesting. We always talk about the refugees in Gaza, right? And how a huge percentage of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees. Was your family, I mean, your parents, were they refugees in Gaza, and where were they from if they were?
They were not. So yes, you're correct. The majority of the population of Gaza, most of the Palestinians are from towns and villages outside of Gaza. They were forcibly expelled in 1948. The ones in the sort of southwest area sought refuge, of course, in the closest urban area to them, which was Gaza. Those in Jaffa came by sea, others came by land. My parents were not. They were actually born and raised there. So on my father's side, I think maybe in the 1920s or something, very early on, his great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, came from, so we're actually originally Balawi, near Tul Karim, and just settled in Gaza, as Palestinians did. They moved around because he felt there was more opportunity there, and settled there. And then his son, my grandfather, became a blacksmith, and he decided that it was more appropriate to take on the family name Haddad. So I'm very working class, roots, urban working class roots. And my grandmother, my mother's side, are from Khan Yunis. So my grandfather was born and raised in Khan Yunis, and my grandmother that he married, as I said, was born in Palestine in Haifa, but she was of mixed Circassian, Kurdish, Syrian ancestry. So even though she was born and raised in Palestine her entire life, she never considered herself Palestinian, interestingly. And yeah, so, but no, they were actually not from, anywhere else, but they were very educated and felt a deep connection. It was through my mother that I learned all of this, and through my grandmother, deep connection to obviously all Palestinians that were one, were connected, and their story is our story.
Just going back to obviously what's happening in Palestine right now, it struck me that you got to experience 9/11 as well. And I think I read somewhere, I could be wrong here, but you mentioned that this is sort of your 9/11 for your daughter to an extent, to experience the vitriol and the hate and the things that are being spewed to us. If you were to sort of, or towards us rather, so if you were supposed sort of to juxtapose that with now.
Yes. So I was a grad student at the time in Boston. And I remember I just newly, when was this, September? Maybe I was just on the cusp of getting married, I think. I wasn't married yet, but I was like engaged. Anyways, I was walking to the Kennedy School at the time, and my then fiance called and said, "You should go back." And I was like, "Why?" And he was like, "I don't think it's safe for you to be out." And I was already near the school, and I walked in, and there's a huge screen in the Kennedy School, and I walked in just as the second tower was being hit. And everybody, like, I remember looked back at me and I was like, oh no, and I was like, maybe I should go back, So I mean, we could spend a whole podcast talking about that. But,
Wait,
it was,
is that a commitment that you're gonna do another one with us to talk about that?
I would be happy because I have a great story to tell. I'll touch on it in a second.
Yeah.
That is both funny and tragic and speaks to the post 9/11 environment and Gaza. But in summary, it was a very, scary, uncertain, terrifying time. Not just, I would say, for all, I'm just gonna, expand and say, I wouldn't just say for I wasn't even American at the time. And I think it made it especially scary because I was a Palestinian without any status, nowhere to go. We didn't know what to expect. And on top of that, I was visibly Muslim. There was no organizations, advocacy organizations at the time. There was ADC, there's no CARE, there was, and yeah, you were constantly looking over your shoulder. I mean, perhaps I was luckier in the sense that I lived in Massachusetts at the time and maybe not some other states, but I think it didn't really fully play out until a few years later, meaning the after effect of all of this. But people were scrambling, people who were already in the limelight, like of course the Sami Al-Aryans and others, of course, they became the targets. Everybody was scared. Nobody wanted to come out and speak on behalf of someone or defend them, or that's what I remember the most. Everybody was kind of on their own. So God forbid something should happen. And I remember this all came to a head a few years later. So I went back to Gaza. At that point, I was married. I had my son. I was pregnant with him, 9 months pregnant. This was January 2004. So just a couple of years after 9/11 or so, yeah. And just at the beginning of the war in Iraq. And that's when I really felt the impact of 9/11 because I was stopped in the airport and then I was taken aside for secondary screening and I was questioned for hours and I was accused of being, everything you can imagine. And this is the story that at some point I'll come back to because it's a very long story. But my passport was taken from me. And I remember, and then this went on for 3 or 4 months and actually much longer. But at one point I was told by the FBI agent who was interrogating me, you realize that, we could make you disappear and nobody will ever know. He said, you realize under the Patriot Act, we could do whatever we want to you and we will be within our full rights and nobody will say a word to us and they'll never know where we sent you. And, I was young and I wasn't taking half of what he was saying seriously. But I remember at that point, I was like, oh, serious. And I didn't have passports. But I had my Palestinian, I think, at the time. But I was like, where is he going to send me to? Where am I? And then I was imagining myself in a maternity Guantanamo suit, or something because I was 9 months pregnant. He wasn't even letting me talk to my husband. And this went on for many months. And they went through my passports and all of I'm just going to let you imagine that at this time, nothing was encrypted. There wasn't really a safe way to store. I had all my contacts listed in alphabetical order at a time in Gaza where everyone was accessible to any journalists. So just use your imagination and imagine who was under under my contacts, political leaders at the time in Gaza, okay? And so then I was like, okay, now I'm really screwed, now they're connecting me to all these people and they think that somehow, but I remember at the time, nobody wanted to help. And, I remember reaching out and the only 2 people that finally got back to me was the ADC and they put me in touch with the ACLU. And they sent a lawyer with me who I didn't realize until many months later was a really famous lawyer who was one of the lawyers who defended Muhammad Ali, the boxer, in his case against the US government. He was the only one who was willing to come and said, you don't have a right to anything, just so you know, but I'm going to try. And was able to get my passport back. But it took many, many more years to finally be able to cross without, it's a longer story because then it goes on. They wouldn't give me a visa, blah, blah, blah. They accused me of, the funny part of this all is that I had a Gaza food product with me called barad to make a slushy. And they thought this was like a chemical weapon. Anyway, another story that is surely to make everyone laugh. But the long and short of it is that, yes, I mean, there were scary times and, and I think my kids never truly appreciated what it meant to be Palestinian, to be Muslim in the United States at that time. And then there was this attempt in those years following to kind of divide the American Muslim community from, like the good Muslim versus, them and us. We're the American Muslims. We're not the other people. And then you, of course, fall in the middle. Like, no, I don't. So when everything happened post October the 7th, and suddenly, because my children were somewhat immune from all of that. And suddenly my daughter was realizing what it meant to be both Palestinian and visibly Muslim. It was, for the first time, it was scary. But I think, alhamdulillah, I was, equipped with my experience, able to kind of guide her through it, where I had nobody. I was by myself here, and there was very few organizations out there, advocacy or otherwise, willing to give you the tools that you needed to figure out how to navigate all this. But everything was happening so fast. And as we know, it was quite literally dangerous for Palestinians and people of color more broadly. Last year, I mean, people were getting killed, right? So it was no, laughing matter. And hearing, people in the highest positions of authority, cast doubt on our deaths, parrot propaganda that the Israelis were using and so on, that just things that make you vomit in your mouth, that shake your head. So yeah, I call it kind of like her 9/11 moment, in the sense that she suddenly, it was what they call like a coming of age moment, like this like moment you were always going to look back and like, this was the time I understood whatever it is, my mission in life, who I was, my identity, my vulnerability, what I was up against, fill in the blank kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. Hey, Zaina, do you know how we had to boycott mainstream soda brands? Well, now there's an alternative, and Palestine is in the name. Sumud Podcast is excited to be sponsored by Palestine Drink Shop, the nation's leading importer of Palestine Cola, which is proud to be a partner with Palestine Drinks, a brand making waves in the beverage industry.
Absolutely, Ed. In fact, three brothers of Palestinian descent based in Sweden were inspired by the growing demand for an alternative to mainstream soda brands, founded Palestine Drinks. Rooted in social responsibility, the company operates under its parent brand, Safad Foods AB. It donates 100% of its profits to support Palestinian civil society organizations or efforts.
If you'd like to show your support, please visit PalestineDrinkShop.com to pre-order Palestine Cola. Be sure to also follow them on Instagram at PalestineDrinks_shop for updates on new flavor releases and exciting giveaways.
We at Sumud Podcast are thrilled to have Visualizing Palestine as a sponsor. Visualizing Palestine creates free and accessible research-based visual tools that are utilized by educators, students, and organizers who want to provoke narrative change and raise awareness about the roots of injustice in Palestine. In fact, we are both members of Visualizing Palestine, and I personally have used Visualizing Palestine's resources and visuals as an organizer and activist in reports, presentations, and even at events.
Community support is the heart of Visualizing Palestine's work. Your recurring membership helps ensure they can thrive and continue making an impact. Join us today and be part of this important mission.
So to access the free downloadable visuals and for more information, please visit visualizingpalestine.org and follow Visualizing Palestine on Instagram at visualizing_Palestine.
I want to segue, if it's okay with you, and I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this or offend anybody, but could I call you the Palestinian Anthony Bourdain? Would that be okay?
Gosh, I would be so honored. I don't know that I deserve that title, but
I think you do, because I actually had my whole family sit down and watch that episode. And I made it very clear to my kids that, we're going to be interviewing you. And it was extremely powerful. One of my favorite parts was, I think it was your uncle or some guy who was yelling. And you're like, no, this is how we talk. We just talk very loudly, right? But I thought and I know that you probably don't agree completely with the narrative that was presented. I think it was obviously a bit one-sided to an extent, but I think what you did was just phenomenal work. I will say, I want to add one thing. Just keep in mind, if we're looking at you and Anthony Bourdain, he had the power of the pen and the power of cooking as well, right? And food. And I think that is very similar to what you're doing for the Palestinian community, generally speaking.
Well, first of all, no, that guy was not my uncle. It was actually one of the families that we visited when we were doing some of the research for the Gaza Kitchen. And it was just, we really liked this particular family because my co-author and I, because they were very jovial, they had really good chemistry. And I had learned later, the mother was like a matriarch. And so she ran the show. And this was another thing that I learned from an anthropologist in Gaza afterwards, was that this particular village in Gaza Beni Sela is known for having matriarchal run like households. So she was in charge of like the farm and divvying up responsibilities. And I mean, it was very odd. Even the husband would cook and she would just tell him what to do. And so that really, I confronted my own biases. I remember when we were cooking together, she said, I said, "Oh, where's Abu Sultan?" And she said, "Oh, he's taking a nap." And in my mind, I was like, "Oh, typical. The man gets to rest, right? While the woman she's been slaving away since like 4 a.m., overseeing the harvesting of the chili peppers. And now poor thing, is going to show me how to make maftoul." And then he suddenly gets up and he's like, "Okay, like, when do we get started?" And I'm like, "Wait, he's cooking?" And she's like, "Well, of course, you thought I was? Like, I tell him what to do. He does everything." And I was like, "Okay." So you're constantly having to, put your own biases in check in your own, society. But regardless, this is the family I took him back to. And a lot of the planning in terms of what happened in the episode was I had to improvise because but let me just say one thing about the guy, but then I'll go back to that. In the middle of when we were filming and eating, the question was that never got answered, that Anthony Bourdain asked him, was if you ever had a chance to go back to your ancestral village, would you go? That was the question. And then the guy responded something like, "وطبعا هو في حد بدوش يرجع، يعني مين اللي ما بده يرجع، يعني بس هم اليهود بيعطونا تصريح ما بيعطونا." Right? And I was like, oh my God. And all I could think about was I totally got him. Like, he was kind of like, of course, like, who wouldn't want to go back? That was what it translated to. But all I was thinking was, oh my God, because he was like going like this, is he probably thinks we're all nuts. Like, he's probably just hearing, "Rah!" So my first thought was just, he's not yelling, this is just how we talk in Gaza, so, and then I don't think we ever answered the question. I never gave him the actual response because it was just, so jarring, I think. So anyway, no, that was not scripted at all. So, but I was going to say a lot of the way that played out was, and this is, I sometimes say is a good lesson for anyone involved in the media world, the whatever, any of this. I really had to push to make it happen and to be on the show. I actually wasn't asked to be on the show. I don't think people know that. They initially came to me when they were with no reservations in the Travel Channel. And someone had told them about my work because there was very little. They had an idea to go to Gaza, but when you Googled Gaza food at that time, nothing came up besides what we had just barely, I don't think we had even published the book. We had just a blog with notes about our research. And so someone, I think it was a friend of mine, I don't know if you know George Azar, but I think his wife Maryam told them, "You should talk to Laila." And so the producer talked to me for hours. And at some point I was like, are they just using me for my research, And then they ended up not being able to go because the Israelis ironically didn't give them a permit to visit Gaza. So they tabled the whole thing, and a year later they moved to CNN and started this new show. And she got back in touch with me. And at that point, I said to her, I just want to be clear that what this relationship is about. Like, are you just calling to waste my time and spend hours, using all of the research that I have done? And then what, she's like, well, what is it, and I was like, well, I would very much like to be with you there with him on the show. And she said, well, that's not really how it works. I mean, if you happen to be there, okay, right? And then a few months later, I was in London for a book event, and I just happened to be with Sami Tamimi, and at that time, his work partner, Yotam Ottolenghi, at that time. And in conversation, he said something like, "Oh, I'm so excited! I'm going to Jerusalem with Anthony Bourdain in a few weeks." And I was like, "You don't say," And then I told him how they had got in touch with me, and he said like, "Oh my gosh, you need to push back on that, whatever, blah blah blah." So I go back to the producer and I was like, Sally, it's interesting because I was talking with Yotam Ottolenghi last week, and he said that you guys are not only are you wanting him to be on the show, but you're flying him there, like with his son and with all. And then she said something like, well, Tony's friends with him and he wanted him there. And I was like, I didn't get in touch with you. You guys got in touch with me, And anyway, long and short of it is that eventually they agreed to have me on, but I was constantly pushing. It wasn't like, And so I really felt like this was going to be something special. And I had an obligation to tell the Palestinian story that nobody else could, you know what I mean, in Gaza. So I really pushed. I mean, I had to go through Rafah. I endured all of that. I had to meet them. It wasn't like they were sitting there and rolling out the red carpet for me. And in every step of the way, they were trying to go with whatever, you know, their local fixer had told them, this older guy who, and I just kept bypassing that and saying, I don't think that's the right decision. I think you should do this. But I was kind of waiting patiently. And when whatever they had planned didn't work out, I would then say, hey, why don't we visit Sultan instead? Hey, why don't we do this? That's how the whole watermelon dish came about. That wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to go to some of the tunnels in Rafah. And when they didn't get permission, they were all kind of twiddling their thumbs. And I said, well, why don't you come with me? I know this family. So, I mean, alhamdulillah, I'm glad I pushed. It just shows you that sometimes you do need to push, not just accept what, you know, script is given to you, because they're always going to go with the usual suspects and whoever they think is, you know. And of course, even then, it wasn't the way I would have liked it, let's say, the narrative. And I understood from him later that if they hadn't done it in this way, they weren't going to air the show. This kind of like, oh, there's crazy people on both sides, if only we can all get along, blah, blah, blah. But I also appreciate that he was one of the only sort of, at that time, I don't know, for lack of a better word, mainstream and definitely food personalities, not only to have gone there, but to show in detail what it involved in terms of getting in, you know, what it meant, what the detail I thought that was really significant was talking about the population of Gaza as being largely one of, you know, Nakba survivors and their descendants, you know, which is something that is often intentionally overlooked, right? And talking about the Nakba. I think that was probably one of the first times I had seen it talked about in that way. And so I do recognize, alhamdulillah, that it was a window, I think, to Gaza for a lot of people who wouldn't have otherwise engaged with it or wanted to understand it. And I'm constantly surprised that it sort of got a new lease on life over the past year and all the horrific everything that's happened in Gaza, where new audiences are being introduced to it and discovering it.
So, quick comment on this one, and I think this is the beauty of it. You know, we talked about the yelling, that's kind of part of the conversation. But one of the beautiful moments that I found in that interview was the eating with the hands versus with the spoon, right? Like, that connection with the food. And I thought that was brilliant, because it wasn't just about how you make the food and where you get the ingredients from, but it was sort of this human touch to how you eat it, which you explained also beautifully in that episode. So
this is a frequent point of contention between my husband and I. I'm always like, look, I don't know, we grew up eating feta with our hands. It's like, if you don't eat it with your hands, it's not, you know,
right.
Like, I remember my mother telling me a story of when they had just gotten married, and I guess they made feta and everybody gathered around. And I don't know if it was my grandfather or his brother, someone told my dad, who had just come back from England and was picking up a spoon, something like, "Ma tafdahnash," you know, like, don't embarrass us. You have to eat with your hands. This is not a dish that you eat with your. So yeah, it's always all these little touches, as you said, that I think that are missing often in the broader narrative when it comes to covering life in Palestine.
I actually thought it was funny. One of the guys in the film said, "God gave us hands, not forks."
Yes, that's right. It was the guy from the clan in Beni Sela, right, who was making that fattit ajr. Which, through that, by the way, I became really good friends with someone from the Al-Garra family. Well, you might know Basim Al-Garra. I don't know if you know him from CARE. And anyway, and his sister Manal, me and him were co-plaintiffs in the case against Biden and company. But she and he recognized their family members from that episode. And he called me and sent me a message immediately. And we're like, oh my God, these are our cousins, you know. So they were so excited. So.
Yeah, but transitioning to now, though, that was a bunch of years ago. And transitioning to now, it's mind-boggling to me how watching that episode, and we watched it, you know, for our interview with you, of course. But there's a lot of conversation on how the produce is harvested, where it's coming from. And it's not just your work, but sort of a lot of the Palestinian chefs that do work on preserving the narrative, preserving the recipes. One important factor one important thing that has been coming up more and more now during the genocide is that you have a huge number of new chefs that are being innovative and trying, even younger ones that have done such an incredible job at utilizing what they have, what they're given, what the land is giving them, even the little that they're able to harvest. How has the occupation and the genocide and colonialism changed the landscape, literally and figuratively, for Palestinian cuisine?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's interesting also, as an aside, to see the evolution of, the sort of the interest and coverage of Palestinian cuisine. Because, when I first got interested in beginning to document this, it was when I was still, working as a journalist. I was in Gaza, and I was, I talk about how I was frequently frustrated because I felt like I was banging my head against a wall. Like I wasn't making an impact. I was writing the same headlines, but people seemed to be more interested in listening and learning when you were talking about personal details. So at that time I had started writing a blog, and then eventually I began to introduce food components, and then eventually, moving forward, worked on the book, on the Gaza Kitchen. At a time when there was almost nothing written, no one. I mean, there was book-wise, there was a couple. There's one that's now fallen into obscurity. I'm trying to figure out where it was. It was more of a stories and some recipes, and then there's another one by Christian Dabdoub Nasser, classic Palestinian cuisine. But this wasn't a thing. It wasn't on the radar of anyone, let alone Palestinians. And sometimes, we're so busy in the act of survival, right? And to think about preservation. Or to think about the most effective ways. I mean, the same applies for Tatriz. It's made a huge resurgence, right? And it was often thought about as something trivial, like, well, why would you want to write about or preserve food, or what's, I sometimes still feel a little sheepish, like in Arabic when someone's introducing me and saying, oh, عندك كتاب طبخ. Like it sounds like I'm some kind of like, whatever, very domestic housewife who's written a thing, and I'm like, but it's not really that. I'm trying to explain. And then I'm like, why am I like feeling defensive about this? But I still get that feeling, like it's not something to be taken seriously. Let's put it that way. That's how it certainly was received. It's never received, actually, I think, proper attention in the Arab world, to be honest, interestingly. But going back to your point, so then that, I feel like the Palestinian food scene really evolved, like from the time we published it. And alhamdulillah, I mean, I'm very proud of this because I always do things again. I always say I have a 99% failure rate. So when something works, I'm like, hey, it's great, this worked. And it's always a total crapshoot. I never know. It's like a hope and a prayer. So I'm really proud of the fact that many Palestinian chefs and writers have said that they got inspired to write their own stuff based on that, and which is phenomenal, So it did open up this whole new kind of wave of, Palestinians in the food world, whether writers or chefs or whatever, including, as we've seen more recently, Palestinians. And by the way, Palestinians in Gaza have always been very passionate about their food. I think people don't know this. They certainly do, I think, other parts of Palestine, because they'll frequently say, oh, انتوا الغزازوة بتحبوا الأكل تحبوا تطبخوا شاطرين, especially the men. Like that, people love cooking there. They're very passionate about their food. But it wasn't, I think, until fairly recently that you started to see this, because suddenly we're getting this live stream of what's happening in Gaza. And a lot of it involves, unfortunately, the deliberate starvation. And in response to that, of course, people, I say resisting that by, cooking with whatever ingredients they have access to, documenting what they're cooking and so on, which in and of itself I found extremely fascinating. And I've been following that closely. I'm actually working on something about that. But, your question was specific, so which I think is great, because I think we underestimate the power of, what I call like sort of culinary resistance, because it's part and parcel, also everything, right? Cultural erasure and so on. Part of, genocide is ensuring that you quash that, and also people's sort of mentally, ability. It's not just about sort of preservation, but the doing aspect, right? Whether you're stitching, whether you're teaching it to your children, whether you're insisting on farming if a farm has been destroyed, whether you're insisting on cooking if all you have is corned beef or whatever, right? I think these are incredibly powerful, validating and healing acts that we really underestimate. Of course, yes, people are doing them for survival, but I think it's actually much more than that in the case of Gaza, and you can see this. In terms of how you were talking about the landscape and so on has changed, this is something we documented extensively, as much space as we had much more in the Gaza Kitchen. And a multitude of interviews with agronomists and economists and aid workers and so on. And they were all kind of warning of the same thing, which nobody was really taking seriously unless you were in that inner circle, which is that at the rate things are going, the way that Israel is controlling the access and movement of everything that goes in and out of Gaza, which was something, by the way, predicted to happen way even before, and I talk about this in the Gaza Mom in my book, right after the disengagement. You can go back as far as 2005. As it was transpiring, even before, right? I remember speaking to so many Palestinian economists saying to me, look, this is going to be a catastrophe for Gaza because they being Israel will now, not have a presence inside of Gaza. Of course, they still have a presence everywhere else, above and around, but will continue to control Gaza remotely and everything, most importantly, about Gaza. So what goes in and what goes out, what's known as access and movement. When we can leave as Palestinians, when we can enter, what produce is allowed in, what's allowed out, what's the quantity, from where. And their predictions all came true because that's exactly what happened. They maintained an iron-hold grip on all of Gaza's borders. They actually closed, the Israelis, the borders indefinitely for months on end in the months after the disengagement, which was just at that point unprecedented for the Palestinian economy, for the farmers in northern Gaza. It seems ridiculous saying this now, given what's happening. But I'm just setting an example. And now this evolves. You continue from 2005, following when Hamas is in power, following then the imposition. Of course, there's always been some kind of closure, but it's getting kind of tighter and tighter, stranglehold on Gaza, of this punishing blockade that has been in place for 18 years, that had a precedent right before, in terms of the sanctions, in terms of even after the disengagement, where just because, for the hell of it, they closed the borders. And even before that, right, there's always some form of closure. But it really comes full circle over the past 17 years. And then, of course, over the past specifically 15, 16 months or so. And the predictions that were made during the disengagement, and then again in 2010, 2011, when I was interviewing all these people who all said to me, like, at the rate things are going, by whatever it was, 20-something, 2021, I don't know what, Gaza will be unlivable. Of course, they weren't predicting that there would be a genocide, but they were predicting, even without a genocide, even the way that things are going with Israel's, blockade on Gaza, with the way that it is allowing in what one, person with humanitarian organization described to me as an intravenous drip of relief into Gaza, right? Only allowing in enough items to, stave off an all-out crisis, just enough so they can absolve themselves of responsibility if push comes to shove and say, hey, each person needs 1,000 calories. That's exactly what we allowed in by food trucks. Not, of course, accounting for issues like access, for sustainability, for productivity, for thriving. It was about just survival, for meeting a minimum caloric need, but never about, and in fact, they stated very clearly that what were known as the tenets of the blockade at the time were, I think this was in WikiLeaks, was no development, no productivity, no humanitarian crisis, in addition to separating Gaza from the West Bank. Meaning, this is what's going to guide our policy, ensuring that, okay, there's just enough calories to absolve ourselves of responsibility, never enough to allow people to develop, to prosper, and so on. Keep Gaza, and this was, I think, from the WikiLeaks as well, teetering on the edge of collapse. So those reasons alone, those policies, which did play out in Gaza, were enough to cause every expert under the sun to be able to predict that, what we're going to see is not going to be pretty in Gaza in terms of the unprecedented rates of, what they, of course, call food insecurity, which I don't like. It's because it's kind of almost a euphemism for me, but basically lack of food sovereignty. So what you're seeing over the years is Israel's deliberate and systematic targeting, control, and destruction of Gaza's food sector and by and large, its food sovereignty. How do you do that? You control the access and movement of what goes in and out. Any order that goes in has to be through you. You monitor the sea, of course, such that, fishermen are always fishing at their own peril, only a few nautical miles into sea, something that is continuously changing. There's a so-called buffer zone. Farmers can't go out, so far. They continue to push, and I always praise them as they're some of my biggest heroes, because I always give the example of this one farmer that I saw planting his farm in Beit Hanun 3 times over with little olive saplings And if you know anything about olive saplings, you know they take 7 to 10 years to become even remotely productive, to bear fruit, not even productive. And, so somebody would say this is an exercise in insanity, right? Like, what is this guy doing? And his response was like, this is my way of resisting. If I abandon the land, that's it. They've won. I'm defeated. So he was like, I will keep doing this, knowing that he will never probably, see, the results of his labor, his toil. But I always think of him an example of even relating to our own activism and organizing, right? You don't base it on the results, But anyways, but this is what you saw, the systematic targeting, destruction, and control of Gaza's food sector, ensuring that Palestinians never had food sovereignty. Of course, this is something you see replicated all over Palestine to lesser degrees, Gaza always being sort of the pilot, right, to understanding, okay, if we can do it here, we can do it elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened, such that more over the years, if I was to compare when we went in 2010, and then I went several times in between, the last visit being 2019, I was supposed to go in 2021 and I wasn't allowed in. But anyway, if I was just to kind of chart it out, everything that people were telling me was coming true, in the sense that more and more Palestinians over the course of those 10 years were becoming food insecure, were unable to feed themselves, were unable to purchase, to access ingredients that were sort of native to their diet, were relying heavily on food aid, which, as we know, is meant for short term, not for a long term. So dependency, which is, very unhealthy. And we're, at the last visit I went, I remember, we're not, 80% of the people were only consuming any kind of animal protein, maybe once a week on Fridays, and it was a very cheap kind of protein. And fish, I visited a family that was like once every 6 months, and it was some kind of frozen, imported. It wasn't. So you're talking about a place that is rich with specific resources. It can't feed itself with grain, but certainly with vegetables and fruits, certainly with fish, certainly with other things. None of those things were accessible to the majority of the population, or very little was accessible. A minimal was accessible to the majority of the population. Olive oil, tahina, but my last visit there, I was shocked to discover that people were having to buy these in a unit's worth for a specific dish. And probably because I was there and they wanted to show me. They would buy like a quarter's worth of tahina to drizzle on whatever. That's it. But nobody had it. Like, somebody laughed when I said, did you have olive oil on hand? They were like, are you serious? Like, it was unthinkable for anyone to have a jug of olive oil just in their kitchen or whatever.
And I think it's also an indictment right now with the genocide. When they talk about starvation, they mean it quite literally, not just by not allowing the food in terms of calories, or sending in whatever's allowed in is unhealthy, as you mentioned, but also the deliberate targeting. I mean, they were targeting food resources, farms. And I remember distinctly watching on the news massive tanks running over strawberry fields, this deliberate destruction is such an indictment on the intention of the genocidal regime of Israel, that not only are we not allowing food in, but we will prevent you from producing your own, which now we see, as we started this conversation, with all these younger generations and people being innovative and planting next to their tents in order to be self-sufficient, even though, away from the eyes of the oppressors, even though it's not massive amounts, but they're still planting small, making their own self-sustaining gardens. But I think it's such a huge indictment. I mean, they can't even farm their own lands, even if it is present, as you were saying. But
no, for sure. I mean, I was just trying to set the context of, like, imagine this is how it was before.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And now it's like, as we say, it's like they're not trying to kid around or use euphemisms or strategies or calculations anymore. They're like, you know what? We're just going to starve you, starve and surrender, or whatever. And that's, to me, the most infuriating part of, I was doing some interview the other day, and it's like the lengths that a lot of the mainstream wants to go to avoid using the G word. It's like that's a game of taboo. It used to be with the word ceasefire. Now it's like genocide. Like, wow, what can we say to avoid using that word? And sometimes I think out loud, like, how else would you describe what's happening? Like the intentionality, the execution of it all. I mean, whereas before they were just like doing all these things and you had to connect the dots. Now they're like, yeah, we're just going to target farmers. We're going to, raise down strawberry fields. We're going to assassinate the people who are cooking the food and distributing it, and the farmer who is trying to grow the food in the areas that we don't want people in, that we just want to ethnically cleanse, with no qualms, because nobody is stopping us. Nobody's stopping them. and nobody will even say the word genocide. And those who do, will be considered rogue members of the international community or whatever, right? I mean, this is the stark reality that we're living under, but I think it makes it all the more important to, again, talk about this, document it, show exactly what it is that's happening. But yeah, I mean, literally, right now, cooking in Gaza, feeding your families, farming in Gaza, all of these things, healing in Gaza, rescuing people in Gaza, all of these things, have become, heroic acts, right? Like Herculean acts, all these small, they're everyday. I mean, I always talk about before, even these everyday ordinary moments are suddenly become Herculean, Palestinian moments that you don't see. They're the sort of the backdrop of Palestinian existence. And I think it equally applies now. And they're just being, they're being slaughtered for just doing what an ordinary thing, right, that you should be doing.
So everything you're talking about actually takes me back to the Anthony Bourdain episode. And at the very beginning, I mean, you mentioned they're trying to cut off food. They were debating at the very beginning, if you remember, who invented falafel.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And I literally wanted to shut it off at that moment, but they're actually stealing our food as well.
Yes.
Yep.
And, excuse me, in a way, I wish they had done a better job on the West Bank portion, but anyway, that's a separate issue. But I'm always like, why did they choose? I mean, there's so many. Vivian Sansour, she had provided a detailed list of an incredible itinerary of things that and they just didn't do any of it. So that's what I'm saying. It took a lot of pushback to get them to actually cover something substantial that wasn't just like, hey, let's talk about falafel or whatever. But yes, I mean, appropriation, we've talked a lot about this. And, I'm, again, really happy to see that it's now, if I'm comparing now, the discourse and the narrative on this versus like 12 years ago, I feel like people are much more attuned to this now, where they really weren't before. Even if I was to chart it back even further, like 20 years ago, I remember being a student, new to this country, and open up some magazines and you would see like, oh, za'atar, this great like Israeli spice, and being like, or whatever, like, what is this? I mean, my most shocking moment, I remember when I was 18, I first came to the US, and one of the local groups on campus was having one of those, what do they call them? Mixers or something. And they were like, come try like Israeli falafel. And I was like, what? That was my first experience with it. And then going to New York and seeing all these Israeli falafel joints. I mean, I was very jarring, Here you felt like, oh my God, مش كفاية, like أخذوا أرضنا, أخذوا كل إشي, مش عارفة أدبر حالي, I barely have a passport, I can barely move around. I'm struggling to make sense of my own history. They've erased our towns. Now, on top of that, the food also, so that was my first, but, and this is a whole separate conversation that veers into all these, people have a lot to say on this issue. Is there ownership over food? Is there whatever, blah, 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 like food evolves? I think really the heart of the matter is, what is the intention? Because food can be wielded, as a weapon of war, as we've seen, as a tool of resistance, of liberation, of cultural preservation, and it can be wielded as a weapon of war and colonialism. And that's exactly what the Israelis have been using it for and have been doing. And this is well documented. It goes back. There's a piece I did for Mondoweiss in which the person interviewing me introduced me to this book. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was almost like a manifest, like a guide to, for colonists to Palestine, for colonizers of Palestine, like culinary guide for colonizing Palestine. That's exactly what it was. And it goes through, it talks about how there's these things you might find repulsive, but they grow here. We must acclimate, we must, stop eating these European things. We must do this, that. I mean, it's really grotesque when you read it. You just want to kind of, again, barf. But yeah, that's the only thing I can say about that is it's very clearly being used as a, wielded as again, a means of cultural suppression, of colonization, of, and so on. It's separate from the context of what happens when there's mingling and in a normative way, right?
And I want to pivot to your conversation with Blinken and obviously the lawsuit with Biden, but I do want to ask you, just to kind of wrap up the Anthony Bourdain piece, when he first met you, if I understood correctly, he basically said that what I just witnessed was effed up.
Oh gosh, yeah.
I'm just curious what conversation. I mean, I don't think he could. This is my opinion, and I don't want to get in trouble, but he couldn't keep a straight face with a lot of the conversations, I believe, on the Israeli side. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. Yes. And sometimes I'm like, man, he really saw the tip of the iceberg because he was just going along with what the producers were you know, arranging for him and so on. And it wasn't like some kind of independent thing where he's like, I want to do this, I want to do that. But I didn't know what to expect. I didn't really know much about him as a person. I didn't, and you always have this fear as a Palestinian is like, is this person going to be sort of sympathetic? Does he get it? Does he not? That was my biggest fear. I always feel like we have this huge hurdle to climb. We're always just going against the tide, right? In terms of, at least getting people to understand the bare minimum of, how atrocious and dystopian this whole thing is. And so that was like, I didn't know where he stood along that line. And so I met him in Gaza City with his full security detail. And I'm just kind of there by myself. And he comes out and he just strolls out of the car and he's like, hey, I'm Tony, And I was like, hi. And so then I just remember the first thing I said was like, so what did you, where were you right now? And he explained, and I was like, so what did you think? I'm just curious. Like, I just wanted to kind of like gauge. And yeah, that's when he was like, the situation there is so like effed up. He's like, I cannot believe what I just saw, but more so, I cannot believe that everyday Americans didn't see what I just saw, don't understand what's happening. And that's when he said that, I was like, okay, he gets it. He's like, that was the first thing that struck me is that he's just like, I feel like every American needs to see what I just saw and then they would understand, and
he wasn't allowed at sea even, right? His security.
Yes. And then he said something like, I told the Israelis, you are not going to like this cake you're baking. At some point, it's going to implode. Is what he said to me. Yes, the sea thing is I got up really early. Oh my God. I remember my daughter was like 6 months old. I had to pump all this milk for her. I was so stressed out and I had to go like at 4 a.m. and meet them and then I guess they were told that it was too dangerous. The Israelis were shooting at all of the fishermen. And I wish I was trying to push for them to go. I was like, we should go. Because I felt like that was important to see and to document. But I think, it wasn't my decision. The security detail decided it was too dangerous for him. And in a way, I wish that they had almost mentioned that and talked about that. Because that's the everyday reality for Palestinians, who, risk their lives going out at sea or farming, as we saw, or in, today's context, just cooking, right? So
I'm just going to throw it out there and then I'm going to kick it over to Zaina. But should we consider some sort of, TV show with Laila?
Oh my God, I would love that. Yeah. I need a team to make it happen. Let's do it. Actually, me and Ahmed Abul Foul from, some of you might be familiar with him he's in The Hague. He's also from Gaza. He was one of my co-plaintiffs. We had an idea to start something called Liberation Kitchen, where we would be cooking something and then discussing like some topical, whatever political theme or breaking down some aspect of. So there you go. We just need a team to.
We'll do a podcast just for that.
Oh my God, I would love it. We should do another one that's a food one and test it out like a pilot. I'll get him on the show and we'll do it. Yeah. So.
That would be amazing. That would be amazing. Speaking of plaintiffs, so the lawsuit was filed, and thank you for that. It was so empowering to see, and I'll let you talk about it here in a second, but the lawsuit was filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights in federal court in California, right? And it's to stop basically Biden, Blinken, and Austin from continuing to provide weapons that are killing Palestinians. Can you please tell us more about the lawsuit and the outcome?
So me, Defense for Children International Palestine, and several other Palestinians, including myself. You had Al-Haq as well, or as organizational plaintiff. You had Ahmed Abu Artamam from Gaza, Al-Garra also from Gaza here in the United States, and several others sued, as you know, the Biden administration, specifically President Biden, Blinken, and Austin, for their failure to stop an ongoing genocide, essentially for their complicity in genocide. And there's so much to say about this now, and I'm trying to think where to start. It was an incredibly powerful experience that came, I think, at a really critical time for Palestinians, especially Palestinians from Gaza. just thinking back to that moment in time in January, it was at the, heels of several months of Palestinians feeling like suddenly the ground was shifting under their feet, day by day. I mean, speaking as a Palestinian from Gaza, I'm on this WhatsApp group for Ghazazwa in the US, and it became like a virtual morgue. Like there was a roll call every day of whose family members or cousins were killed and condolences were being offered. It was literally like a mourning hall. And we couldn't keep up, and then people were giving information to each other, checking in on their family members. In the meantime, we were having to fight what we felt on several fronts, whether it was on the local front, in the councils, whether it was in my case, in my daughter's school, pushing back at different, almost these copycat letters that were being sent across the country by administrators to schools and universities and workplaces. And then on top of that, to hear your own president question the validity of the deaths of your people and your family members, and again, continue to repeat debunked propaganda, jeopardizing your life, your family's life, other Palestinians' lives in the United States. All of this was happening at once. So imagine what it felt like to be a Palestinian in the United States. I mean, you don't have to imagine, but at that moment in time. But this is when the court date was happening in January, after all of this, or at the the middle of all of this, at a time when we weren't yet in this place. Not that we are now, a calm place, but it was suffocating. It was exhausting, and you felt completely invisible, right? And you were facing these sort of unprecedented times, and you couldn't believe that this was actually happening. What was called sort of the fastest paced, deliberate starvation and most well-documented genocide of people in recent history. And everybody was seeming to not only turn a blind eye to it, but encourage it, right? At the highest places of power. And we initially our team was shocked that we were even given a court date because they set the expectation very low. The idea was to use every tool at our disposal as Palestinians, as organizers, as anyone who was in a position to do anything, as human beings, as Americans residing in this country, right? And this was one of them. So how can we continue to exert pressure on the systems that are allowing this to happen? It's sort of the question we were trying to answer ourselves, and this was one of those means. But they said, look, don't be surprised if it's dismissed outright and we don't even get a court date. So that was what we were thinking. We will not even get a court date. It's announced that this is happening. It's great. It's a step in the right direction. It's a means to put pressure, but they won't even let it come to court or the news cycle. It's just going to be dismissed. So we were really shocked that not only was it not dismissed, that we were given a court date. And not only were we given a court date, but they were allowing in-person testimony, which the lawyers themselves couldn't believe. They were scrambling to prepare us. And not only were we given in-person testimony, but it was unrestricted in terms of the length of time testimony. So that was truly shocking and a huge, I think, success and win in terms of the historical record. Because I think people sometimes are so fixated on, like, what was the outcome? But you have to understand why we did this and how it played out. It was really important, first of all, I think, as a means of validation for Palestinians as a community, what we were going through, what we were suffering, to be able to also do something with our grief and our anger and our hurt, but also to be heard, for the first time in all of those months by someone in a position to hear you and to say to us, which he did, this is Judge White, I hear you. I want you to know you've been heard, and to allow us to express ourselves and to put the feelings of validation, but also, again, putting on the historical record that all of this talk for the first time in history about the Nakba and what the Nakba is and what the experience of Nakba survivors and their descendants as part of our group was, and how that relates to Gaza and how that relates to the genocide and so on and so forth. This was the first time this had ever happened. And that is on the court record now for anyone to view. I think that it was also a means, of course, of consciousness raising and awareness in terms of putting this on the radar to people. It just happened to coincide, by the way, with the ICJ ruling. That was not on purpose, but it just happened to be on the same day. And so that was, I think, really fortuitous and quite incredible. And so for all of those reasons, we felt it was a huge success. The judge in that case, which was a Bush-era appointed judge, came back and said in his ruling that I don't need to say these things, but I feel compelled to say them. He essentially implored the Biden administration to question its what he called unflagging support for Israel. And he implored essentially anyone who is able, any person, any American, to do what they could to put an end to what he called Israel's military siege on Gaza. I mean, it was crazy. It was like, here you have this judge essentially calling out to people, to activists, to anyone, do what you can. I mean, we couldn't believe it, you know? And it was this real moment. It was, you know, very uplifting. There's no other way to put it. After months and months of feeling demoralized, exhausted, you know, seeing your family slaughtered, it was a ray of light, you know? Now, of course, in the end of the day, which was to be expected, he said, I can't force the executive branch. I can't get involved in foreign affairs because of what's known as the political question doctrine, that the judicial branch can't get involved in the executive branch's, management of foreign affairs. And of course, we pushed back saying, well, what our lawyers pushed back saying, well, what alternative do our clients have, us as plaintiffs, as Palestinians, if they cannot be heard in their own courts, and if there is nothing they can do to stop a genocide or bring their complaints to court? And, you know, he was extremely sympathetic. And the fact that he made those comments and that he was clearly disturbed about what was happening. And I should say that we heard testimony from an expert talking about this being a plausible genocide was, again, extremely powerful. And I don't know if anyone out there saw the hearing, but this was the only witness that the government tried to object to, not once, but multiple times. There's a great New York article about it, questioning everything from his credentials, to which he sort of rather humorously replied. They said, are you an expert? Do you have a degree in foreign relations? And he said, I wasn't aware that was a degree you can get, you know? But they kept objecting to everything he was saying because they just didn't want it on the record. They didn't want it. And now Biden is the only living president to have it on his record of having been accused of genocide. And he said, this is, you know, what we, as experts in this field, we work not just to document past genocides, which is one of the limits of the law in this case, but to be able to prevent ongoing ones. And I think this applies, equally across the board when we talk about the limits of the law. Of course, we continue to push and appeal, and, you know, subsequent judges, of course, continue to implore the political question doctrine. But for us, it's become an issue of continuously exerting pressure, making sure that the administration, you know, that we're doing what we can. Again, going back to my analogy about that farmer, not sort of sweating the results, but putting forth the work and the effort that we're obligated to do, considering our role here as taxpayers, to continue to exert pressure against the administration and keep this issue alive. So we're continuing to push. We want to keep this alive as long as we can, even if that means taking it to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, thank you for that. I thought it was extremely powerful, the whole lawsuit, the way it went down. And I thought it was extremely brave of you all to get together and do this together as a team, to be vulnerable together, to sit there together, and to represent the people of Gaza. You know, as we say in Arabic, "Rafin rasna," it takes a lot. It's not just showing up in front of the cameras. So thank you for your representation and for taking this on for CCR and all the other organizations that are.
Thank you so much. I'm going to convey that to them. It does mean a lot, because I think we just all really weren't thinking through, what are we doing? What we just were like, basically at that point, it's like, what can we do? Whatever you think that we can do that makes sense, that will help, you know, we're willing to do, we want to do. But it's so hard because you're constantly, you know, it's like you're shooting in the dark. You don't know what's going to work and what's not. And I think it's just, you know, I think our one of our team put it best when she said, it was Katie Gallagher, who was amazing, by the way, when she said that all of these things build upon each other. Mm-hmm. You know, there's no, what is it called? Sorry, I'm trying to think of the right word here. There's no statute of limitations on genocide. In other words, it took decades for Pinochet to, you know, finally get accused and so on. And I think that makes sense to me, especially for people who are thinking very practically. And that's what keeps me going, is that everything, it all contributes, right, to, you know, and then eventually, inshallah, ya Rab, one day, not only will the genocide end, but, you know, this very unjust system and regime will crumble.
Absolutely. A little bit of a tangent. We were boycotting meetings with Blinken and the White House. And that was very deliberate, because we were not being heard, because the genocide continued, because they kept sending the weapons. Initially, I remember our first conversation when we spoke, you said you had met with Blinken and Biden. And then after the conversation, or I think it was Blinken at the time, and then later on, the movement decided we're not meeting, and, you were part of that movement, and we said no more meetings. Why did you decide to meet initially? And then why did you decide not to meet?
I thought you were going to say, why did you go from meeting him to suing him?
Well, that too, but I mean, that's even a better step.
Okay. I'll tell you why. It was because it was literally 2.5, maybe 3 weeks after October 7th. It was very fresh into everything that had happened. And if you remember at that time, did any of us really think we would be in the situation we're in today? I think most of us thought it would be a few weeks at most, a month, and that's it. And we were scrambling to do whatever we could in our power to put an end to this, right? Meeting with our senators, whatever. And when Hani at the time, Hani Matoun, called and said, hey, sort of some of the veterans, Arab American in the community arranged this meeting with Blinken, but we need a Gaza representation and a woman. There's nobody coming, basically. So he said, I can't think of anyone better than you. Can you attend? And this was, again, just 2.5 weeks in. And I was like, well, what's the objective? And he was like, well, I just want you to be as basically, blunt as you can, for lack of a better word, to keep it clean. And don't sugarcoat anything, and just be as harsh as you can with the reality and what needs to be done. So I said, yeah, I can do that. Because we really thought at that point, very, naively, that there's no way. If only, and I think a lot of us at some point have felt this way. Now, of course, I don't believe this at all. I've become so, if I was ever had any sliver of faith in this system, now I have, it's below ground, right? So I think we naively, foolishly thought, oh, if they just hear it from us, they clearly do not know how bad this is and what's going to happen if they continue to give them free rein, right? And this was on the heels of also meeting, actually, with Van Hollen had refused to meet with us. Now, Van Hollen historically has had a pretty good stance on Gaza. He continues to have a pretty... Now, at this time, he wouldn't meet with us yet. And one of my friends said, hey, he's coming to my house for some kind of Asian fundraiser thing, or not, whatever, event, not fundraiser. I just want you to come here, and I'm going to make sure that I put him with you so you can directly ask him a question about ceasefire at a time when everyone was so scared to. And even he would not, at that point, say ceasefire. He didn't want to be caught saying it on camera. So he kept saying, trying to find a way around it, right? We must allow Israel to do what it needs to do for now, but I know it's heartbreaking and blah, blah, blah. We have family there. And when he said that, I was like, we're screwed, because this is Van Hollen saying this, Then we met with Blinken, and, people told him this is right before my aunt was killed, by the way, and before Hani's brother was killed by about 2 weeks. And we told him what we thought he needed to hear. We did not sugarcoat anything. I was extremely harsh. And, these people, what are they going to do? They're war criminals. They're diplomats, war criminals. This is my conclusion. But he and I pushed back. Anytime that everyone had a chance to speak, I pushed back again. And I said, I'm not done. I actually want to say one more thing. And I'm going to, retort back to your point on this. And even then it was abundantly clear. And this is what we said. Let's not, joke around. Look at all of the figures that have come out so far. Look at the satellite imagery. Look at the data. What is it telling you? It's telling you, because even early on, if you recall, what were the first targets before things got really bad? It was Gaza City. It was all the cultural markers. It was the mosques and the churches. It was all the universities. It was the archives, the National Archives. It was, the oldest church in Gaza. It was the Omari Mosque. It was the Rashad al-Showa Cultural Center. It was the parliament by my house. All these things are around my house. So I said, what is this telling you? Is this really about Hamas? I said, there's something brewing here, that is very unsavory. There's something rotten in Denmark, right? And this has nothing to do with, but he just kept insisting. And this is when I knew that not only will I never want to engage with this administration again, but if I had a chance, yes, I would want to sue them. He said to me, I said, what is the end game here of this administration and of Israel? Because this is not clear to any of us. If you're allowing them this early on to get away with all of this, and you're okay with this, And he said, we don't know what the end game is. We don't know what the day after looks like. And it's somewhat concerning. But the conversations happening internally within the administration, I'm telling you, are different happening, publicly, blah, 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 which is their line. But that one statement, when he said we don't have a day after plan, all I can tell you is, and he kept saying we, as though him and the Israelis were one, right? That we will not go back to a status quo with Hamas in power. But we don't have a day after plan, and the Israelis don't have a day after plan, and we don't know. And so when he said that, I immediately knew it was going to be really bad. That essentially they were going to let them do whatever they want. There's no red lines. Before they even said the red lines thing, right? وخلص يعني طلعنا برا furious, upset. We had said
really quick, was it at that moment you realized that he was essentially a double agent?
I mean, I didn't know him personally or otherwise. You know what I mean? Nobody, I think, was following very closely unless you happened to be covering Washington affairs or something, maybe Zaina. There were several thoughts going through my head. A, he's the Secretary of State. He's a diplomat. He's going to say all these things are scripted. We shouldn't expect him to say something else. And if we have those expectations, then, you're in the wrong game. Get it out of your head. I think that we sometimes have false expectations or hopes about what we expect these people to say. And that's, I think, where the role of disruption and pressuring from the outside, historically, change always comes from the outside. It doesn't come from the inside. But there's, roles to be played in terms of how you exert that pressure. So I think we can never expect them to say anything that they're going to say, right? But what I think truly shocked me is sort of this feigning, sympathy with Palestinians. Oh, it's so tragic. Oh, he kept saying the thing about who was killed at that month. Which Palestinian was killed? A couple of years older or younger than my own son or daughter. I can't remember. He always tries to bring in, humanizing my own family. I think about my own, and it's just gross, And so I knew that it was hopeless to engage with them at that point. Let's put it that way. And that it was what we were going to see was very dangerous, because this was an administration that was really just doing the unprecedented, the unthinkable, establishing no red lines, that I don't even know if Biden was fully together at that point or not, who he was being guided by, that there was also a lot of internal, it seemed, dissent. That was the other thing we gleaned within the State Department that he was trying to downplay. So that's kind of what I got, I think, out of all of that. But I will say, you asked me about at what point, the point that I realized that pressure and disruption is often more effective wasn't after that. It was after months of trying to meet with Van Hollen to get him to be one of the first Democratic senators to call for a ceasefire. And our last meeting in December of last year, when he said, no, I won't do that, but what's the point, he said, but I'm going to pass an amendment to the bill that he's trying to pass. And someone responded and said, well, he'll just bypass it. And he said, no, he won't do that. Well, 4 hours later, he bypassed it. And that day, a group of activists in our community decided to start showing up at his doorstep every morning and banging drums and sending him hundreds of letters. And it took 2 weeks for him to call for a ceasefire. Now, I can't say for sure if that was the reason, but I know his wife was very upset. So these things do work. It's difficult for people to see that. I think just talking more broadly about activism, organizing, it's important for people not to be short-sighted, to think of the long game, not to get, overwhelmed or burn out, and understand what you're in for, who you're doing this for. Again, not always have it be necessarily results-driven, short-term results-driven, right? But have it be sort of principles, I think, driven as well. And that you're not doing this for yourself, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think talking about that, I think it was extremely powerful because they kept trying to meet with Palestinians and Arabs. And it's part of a strategy that was very clear to those of us in the movement who were organizing, that they were trying to divide us and that they were tokenizing us and trying to just use this as a way to put on social media. I met with Palestinians and Arabs, and they're okay, kind of, that
exactly
we're working on the same level. And that was one of the main reasons, other than the fact that they're liars and hypocrites, obviously, that we decided not to meet, and that it wasn't an option at all. But I want to point out, just really quickly, I want to point out the fact that it wasn't just people refusing to meet. It was people refusing to meet, like your brother, for example, who then released this 12-page brilliant and heartbreaking letter. And I want to point to it because, as you mentioned, activism and organizing and being part of a movement is not binary. There's
Absolutely.
so many different ways and tactics that are used, whether it's refusing to meet, whether it's banging pots and pans and whatever in front of their homes, whether it's writing, cooking, So I do want to give a shout out to all of those who used alternative measures or means to bring about attention to the issue, particularly as we are talking about the issue of meetings with Lincoln, because principles and red lines matter. We are more powerful than we are given credit for. And yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that, there was so much pressure on my brother, like from, oh no, it's not just meat. It's not a big, and his letter ended up being so much more effective, I mean, and I think as things just got uglier and uglier, and every time we would hear about new aid packages on the heels of another hospital getting attacked, on the heels of another tent massacre, it just became unfathomable. I mean, what we're witnessing is truly unprecedented in any way, shape, or form to engage or indicate our support in the terms of the elections for this administration or this party, given what they were doing. I mean, it's like they were going above and beyond, out of their way to be able to villainize us, to ostracize us, to just basically allow Gaza to be destroyed. And I think, if anything, you had said, interestingly, I don't know if you remember, this is just a side note, I think that, of course, Blinken, being the diplomat he is, the public face, do you remember the time he cringed when Biden was meeting with the Chinese, I don't know if it was the ambassador or who, I can't remember. It might not have been, it might have been a minister. And he said something quite atrocious. Do you remember what it was? I can't remember. And Blinken went like this, like, why did you just say that? So I feel like he was constantly trying to dial back, Biden's buffoonery and be the window dressing to genocide, to be like, I'm the humanitarian, I'm the pleasant diplomatic face of all of this, of being co-collaborators in genocide.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but my assumption or my belief was he was just in there to collect data, collect info. This is what they're saying, this is what they're thinking, and then sort of reporting that back to whoever else, who his real boss is.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, oh, you think? Maybe. Who knows? I was thinking more, I mean, I know after that, somebody tried to get me into an NSA meeting and they wouldn't let me in. So I was like, yes, I'm finally on the blacklist, So I mean, this was after the lawsuit, so I was like, not surprising. But basically, I don't know. I don't know if they're checking off, as Zana said, a box that, hey, we met with constituents or whatever of this community and that community. They call them listening sessions. I concluded they truly just don't care about us. You know what I mean? And if it was evidenced in the elections, if they wanted to, they could have rectified their behavior. They deliberately chose not to. I urge anyone in the community, in the broader Arab community, to question in the fallout of the election their own, motivations, allegiances, behaviors, and think about, was it worth it? You know what I mean? The damage that was done to the community versus whatever they think that they're doing, working from the inside or whatever, so I don't know.
So discussing forms of resistance or being an advocate, I want to talk about your book a little bit here. I know you have two books. This one is Gaza Mom, Palestine, Politics, Parenting, and Everything in Between. And you also have the Gaza Kitchen, A Palestinian Culinary Journey. I just want to talk about this one a little bit, if you don't mind, and kind of the journey around.
Yeah, it's so funny because it kind of sometimes makes me cringe because I was so young. But I also recognize that it, especially after October 7th, that it documented a specific period in time in Gaza that has become so crucial to informing what's happening right now. Anyway, yeah.
So was it sort of a collection of your blogs, if I understood correctly?
Yeah. So at the time, I was living in Gaza. I was working for Al Jazeera and for other online, freelancing as well. And I was raising my son because my husband was here and did not have a Hawiyah, so he couldn't go to Gaza. And at some point, my cousin suggested, hey, maybe you should keep a blog about your experience when blogging was fairly new. And I've never been very good or savvy. Even then it was pretty rudimentary at these things, but I tried my best. And I think I didn't realize, and I always felt, I think as many Palestinians in the 90s and into the early 2000s, sheepish about telling my own story. Like, who am I to tell? I don't have that interesting of a story, do you know? Like, I just wanted to focus on other people. And often we're made to feel, I think, also as Palestinians, well, if it's not like harrowing or bloody enough, really, like, who cares? It's not something worth talking about. And furthermore, why would we talk about our personal lives or share the intimate details of our personal lives like that? We always kind of distance ourselves from the lens, let's put it that way. And I think thusly you didn't see a lot of Palestinians narrating their own experiences. I might be wrong, until fairly recently, like over the past 15 years, maybe, right? Before that, it was maybe we were talking about other things or writing about other things, or it was others doing the writing for us. Let's put it that way, right? Anyway, so that's how the blog started. And I was very surprised, and I always felt slightly uncomfortable. Like, do I really need to be talking about me? But then I would talk about just my son and just kind of normal toddler antics, but, in the context of being in Gaza at that time during the Second Intifada, and then eventually during the disengagement and the years that followed. And I was surprised that some of the people that were the most interested actually were oftentimes Israelis who would be reading and leaving comments and things. And the reality was, and continues to be, there's almost a total blackout. They're neither interested or made to be interested, whether by way of their schooling or whatever, in the lives of Palestinians, and specifically in Gaza, right? But yeah, so I was documenting just, everyday life, whether it was in terms of raising my son. A lot of it had to do with crossing the border. So a lot of the posts were, what it involved to be able to have to, go to Rafah, wait at Rafah, cross Rafah, and vice versa, cross back into Gaza. All of the intricacies and mundane details and conversations and frustrations that happened. And I think that I would say, be the theme. These everyday, ordinary moments and frustrations of Palestinians, to me, are really collectively what make the Palestinian experience. And I think what helps others truly understand the Palestinian experience. You could take any one incident and say, this hospital was bombed today, or this person was killed today, which is obviously tragic, but it's not the bigger story or the bigger picture over decades, right? Which is the invasiveness of the Israeli settler colonial apartheid regime and occupation on Palestinian lives, right? On everything from, involving, are the brand of diapers you want accessible, to when you can leave or wherever you happen to be living on any given day, to where you can study and if you have the right permits, on and on. But these are kind of the stories I was trying to shed light on from my own personal vantage point. And again, you see how I'm still kind of skittish about it? I'm like, some of them were kind of like, it almost seems childish. I was like much, much younger at the time. But I also still value that they do tell a specific story at a specific time that helps us understand what's happening in Gaza right now. And I remember feeling somewhat validated when I had a chance to, Allah yarhamu, meet. He came to visit me in the US. And we met several times after that, but this was the first time. We met both here and in Gaza. And he said to me, Gaza mom, and he was like, you are like the inspiration for me to be able to teach everyone in Gaza about how to tell their own stories. And I was so humbled. I was like, I'm going to cry saying this, because I didn't really think I'm not the best storyteller. I'm not the best writer. I'm really not. But I think he saw value in the importance of narrating the personal, excuse me, as Palestinians. And I this is the message I keep giving people too, is tell your stories. They're not trivial. I think they're so incredibly important to filling in the details and really helping people understand the broader Palestinian struggle and experience. And yeah, I had a chance to go back and speak to his students, several years later in Gaza, in what was formerly the Islamic University. But yeah, so eventually Helena Coban, who was at the time herself a veteran journalist, had started an independent publishing group called Just World Book, that's now Just World Educational. that also published a lot of Rifat's works, and said to me, I would really like this to be kind of the pilot or the flagship. Can we turn it into I said, yeah, we could try. I mean, neither of us knew a lot about what this entailed or how it worked. So it does sometimes feel like it was kind of shoddily put together. But yeah, that's how it came to be. She was really a mentor of mine and helped me kind of piece all the pieces together and make sense of them in a way that made sense from a narrative perspective, I would say.
Thank you for that. And the book, that book, and also the Gaza Kitchen are both brilliant books that, we recommend everybody read for preserving, Palestinian history and culture. But please never underestimate the value of your voice, Laila, and everybody else listening. I mean, as Palestinians, we all have our stories, we all have our narratives, and they're all important. They're all part of who we are, and we must preserve them at all costs. And
absolutely, yeah.
I'm so glad you put those in a book, no matter how professional or unprofessional or how highly you regard it or not. I think it's a treasure. So thank you for that. And thank you for documenting Palestine through food and recognizing the importance of it. And of course, thank you for being with us today. It's such an honor to talk to you and to have you with us.
It was my honor. It felt like, again, sitting with family and friends, which is, I think we all need to do that more, especially with what's happening. So alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.